You stopped carrying them. That is the part you can name. What you cannot name is what arrived in the place where the carrying used to live. It is not relief. You expected relief. You were told by everyone who writes about this that what comes after the leaving is freedom. They lied, or rather, they spoke from a place they had not yet inhabited. What comes after you stop carrying everyone is not freedom. It is a silence so complete that you mistake it. At first, for failure, you recognize this, the loneliness has a name, and the name is older than your healing. The mistake most people make at this stage is to look backward. They assume the silence means the work was wrong, that the leaving was premature, that the people they stopped carrying must have been carrying something for them too. And now that something is gone, and now they are bereft. This is the first lie the void tells. It tells it persuasively because the void speaks in your own voice. I want you to understand something before we go further. What you are inside right now is not depression. It resembles depression. The fatigue is similar. The flatness is similar. The strange disinterest in things that once organized your days, that too is similar. But it is not the same thing. Depression is a pathology. What you are in is a phase. Jung, in the second of his two essays on analytical psychology, called it the interregnum, the time between governments, when the old authority has been deposed and the new authority has not yet taken its seat. He used the word deliberately. He knew what he was naming. The old self has been deposed. You did that. You stopped answering the phone calls that drained you. You stopped explaining yourself to people who had decided, long before you spoke, that you would be the one to bend. You stopped being the emotional infrastructure of rooms you did not build. That self, the carrier, the holder, the one whose nervous system was the family weather has been removed from office quietly, without ceremony. There was no last day. You only noticed, weeks later, that the carrying had stopped. What no one tells you is that the new self does not arrive in the same moment. There is a gap. The gap is the whole subject of this lecture. I will return to this in a moment. First, the room. There is a particular feeling in the body when you enter a house you used to live in but no longer do. You know the layout. Your hand still reaches for the light switch in the right place. The smell is still partly yours, but the rooms have been emptied not by anyone else, by time itself. And now the space that was once dense with your life is just a shape. That is what your interior feels like now. The architecture is intact, the furniture is gone. You walk through your own days and the rooms echo. This is not a metaphor. This is the precise phenomenology of the post-individuation void, and Jung was clear about it. When the persona drops and the carrying self is a persona, a very thick one, often built before you had language, there is a period in which the ego cannot find itself in the old reflections. The mirrors that used to work do not work. The people who used to call up the familiar response are no longer calling up that response. You walk past the mirror in the hall, and the woman in it looks like someone you knew a long time ago. Most people, faced with this panic, they reach back. They call someone they had stopped carrying and offer to carry them again, just for an evening, just to feel like themselves. And it works briefly. The old self animates, the room fills with the familiar weather, and then, an hour later or a day later, the silence returns, deeper than before, because now it is contaminated by the brief regression. Do not do this, or rather, if you have already done this, do not be ashamed of it. The reaching back is part of the phase. It is the psyche testing whether the old structure is truly gone or merely sleeping. What you learn when you do it is that it is gone. The animation was performance. The weather was rehearsed. You can still do it. You will simply find afterward that you no longer live there. There is a passage in the Tavistock Lectures where Jung speaks about the way the unconscious withdraws its projections from the people we have used to know ourselves. He does not say it kindly. He observed that the withdrawal is experienced by the ego as a kind of bereavement, even when no one has died and no one has left. The bereavement is for the version of yourself that existed only in their gaze. When you stop carrying someone, you also stop being the one they could see. Both selves end. The grief you feel is not entirely for them. It is for the you that was visible inside the carrying. This is the part the healing books do not write about. They cannot. To write about it would be to admit that the freedom they promised was not the whole story, that what comes after the leaving is, for a time, not arrival but suspension, that you will stand in your own life like a visitor for longer than anyone warned you. There is a Latin word for this state, used by the alchemists Jung studied so carefully in his later years. They called it the nigredo, the blackening. It is not exactly your situation, because the nigredo is the active dissolution, the burning down. What you are in is what comes immediately after the cooled ash, the dark water, the period when the fire has done its work and the next stage has not begun. The alchemists, who were not sentimental men, called this period necessary. They did not say it was pleasant. They said it could not be skipped. Anyone who tried to skip it produced a false gold, which is to say, a self that looked whole but rang hollow when struck. You are not producing false gold. You are letting the ash settle. That is the entire work of this phase, and it cannot be hurried. I want to say something now that may sound strange, but I will say it precisely. The loneliness you feel right now is not a sign that you made the wrong choice. It is a sign that you made the right one deeply enough that the old structure cannot reconstitute itself to comfort you. If the carrying had been a lighter thing, a habit, a preference, a learned behavior, its absence would not feel like this. The fact that the absence feels like the floor has fallen out is the evidence that what you stopped doing was not a behavior. It was the structure of your selfhood. The ego that was built on it has nowhere currently to stand. It will find ground again, but not in the place it stood before, and not on the schedule you would prefer. There is something else I want to name, and then I will let this part rest. The people you stopped carrying have not, in most cases, understood what has happened. They experience your withdrawal as cruelty, or as illness, or as a phase they expect you to come out of. They are waiting for the old you to return. Some of them are kind about the waiting. Some of them are not. Either way, their waiting is a pressure you can feel without being told it is there. The pressure is real, and the pressure is also not your problem. Their grief for the version of you they could use is a grief they will have to do without your participation. You cannot carry their grief about the fact that you stopped carrying them. That recursion would consume you entirely. The silence around you right now contains their waiting. It contains your own bereavement for the visible self that lived inside their gaze. It contains the ash of a structure that took decades to build, and underneath all of that, faint at first, almost inaudible, it contains something else, something that has not yet spoken, because what is forming in you cannot speak in the old language. That is what this lecture is about. The thing that has not yet spoken, the self that is forming in the silence, slowly, without your supervision, in a phase that has a name Jung gave it, and that almost no one in the popular literature has the patience to describe. You did not fail. You did not leave too soon. You did not stop carrying everyone in error. What you did was complete a movement that the popular framework does not have a stage for. The framework ends at you, left. Jung's framework continues from there, into the part you are inside now. That continuation is what we will walk through together. Before I take you further into the phase itself, I have to clear something away. There is a confusion that almost everyone in this stage carries, and if it is not named early, it will distort the rest of what you hear. The confusion is this: you have been told by therapists, by books, by friends who mean well, that what you are feeling is grief from leaving. That phrase is not wrong. Exactly. It is just too small. It treats your state as the aftermath of a transaction. You ended a relationship. You ended several relationships. And now you are mourning, as if the work were to feel the feelings, process the loss, and return to a recognizable life. That is not what is happening to you. What is happening to you is structural, not transactional. You have not lost a set of people. You have lost the version of yourself that those people called into existence. Those are different losses. The first is grief. The second has no English word that I trust, which is why Jung went back to Latin, and the alchemists, and the dream material of his patients to describe it. He needed a vocabulary that had not been worn smooth by self-help. The reason this distinction matters is that grief, properly mourned, ends. The structural loss does not end in the same way. It does not resolve into acceptance. It resolves into the slow formation of a different self, which is not the same process and does not operate on the same timeline. If you treat this phase as grief, you will keep waiting for the feeling of resolution to come. It will not come, not because you are doing something wrong, because resolution is the wrong category. What you are inside is closer to gestation. Something is being formed very slowly, in conditions that require darkness and stillness. The discomfort you feel is not the discomfort of healing, it is the discomfort of a structure that has not yet finished assembling itself. You cannot rush this. You also cannot, properly speaking, participate in it. The forming is happening below the level at which your conscious will can reach. This is what Jung meant when he wrote, and I am paraphrasing, because I want you to hear the substance, not perform a citation. that the ego must learn to wait on the self. The self is not your conscious identity. It is the larger organizing center of the psyche, what he called the imago Dei in the individual. It moves on its own schedule. When the old ego structure has been dismantled and you, by stopping the carrying, have dismantled yours, the self is what forms the new arrangement. But the self does not consult the calendar. It does not respond to your wish for it to hurry. It works in the way that a forest works after a fire, which is to say, in seasons that have nothing to do with your impatience. I want to give you a dream now. I treated a woman once. In the middle period of my work, she was in her late 40s. She had recently completed what she called the leaving year, meaning 12 months in which she had systematically ended her role as the emotional center of an extended family, and she came to me with a dream she had repeated in slightly varied forms 3 times in a single week. She dreamed she was walking through her childhood home, not the home she lived in as an adult, the older one, the one she had not seen in decades. The rooms were, as she remembered them in their layout, the wallpaper, the position of the windows, the smell of the wood in the hall, but all of the furniture was gone, not stolen, not moved, simply absent, as if the house had been emptied with great care by someone who knew exactly where each piece belonged and had decided that none of it was needed anymore. She walked from room to room. In each room, she looked for something she did not know what, and in each room, she did not find it. In the last room, the small one at the back of the house, where her mother used to keep the sewing things, she stopped. The window was open. The light coming through it was the color of late afternoon in autumn. She stood in the empty room and felt in the dream that she had been waiting her entire life to be alone in this room and only now had understood it. Then she woke up. I want you to stay with that dream for a moment, because almost everything about your current state is inside it. The house is the structure of her former selfhood, built in childhood, occupied through adulthood, intact in its architecture but empty now of the things she had used to furnish her identity. The furniture is gone. Notice that she does not grieve the furniture. She walks through the rooms, she looks, and in the last room, the small one, the one her mother used, she stops. The window is open. The light is autumn light, which Jung associated throughout his work with the phase of the psyche that is past its summer and approaching its longer interior. She is alone. The aloneness is not a deprivation. It is, in the dream, the thing she had been waiting for without knowing it. That dream described her phase precisely. The selfhood she had built in order to be useful to her family was gone. The architecture of who she had been remained. She still had her body, her name, her history, but the contents of that selfhood, the constant inhabitation of it by other people's needs, had been removed. And what she found in the smallest and most overlooked room of the structure was that the emptiness was not punishment, it was the condition under which something else could finally be heard. I will tell you what I told her, because it is what I want to tell you. The dream was not asking her to do anything, it was naming where she was She had reached the small back room. She had stopped looking. The light was already there. This is the part of the phase that the popular framework cannot describe. Because the popular framework is committed to the language of arrival, it wants to tell you that you have healed, that you are now free, that the next chapter is beginning. The dream does not speak in those terms. The dream says you are in an empty house, and the light is real, and the waiting was the point. Now I want to name something specific that may be happening in your body, because Jung was always clear that the psyche is not separate from the somatic, and this phase has a body to it that almost no one will warn you about. You may be sleeping more than usual, or less. You may be experiencing a flatness of appetite, not because you are unwell, but because the body, when it is in this kind of restructuring, withdraws energy from peripheral functions in order to perform the deeper work. You may find that activities which used to feel pleasurable now feel only neutral, not unpleasant, not effortful, simply neutral. You may notice that you do not particularly want to see people, even people you love, and that when you do see them, you return home tired in a way that is disproportionate to the visit. None of this is pathology. All of this is the body managing the energy cost of the structural reformation happening inside it. If you go to a doctor in this phase and describe the symptoms, you will likely be offered a diagnosis. The diagnosis will be partly correct in the sense that the symptoms are real and your suffering is real. The diagnosis will also be incomplete because the framework of pathology cannot see the phase you are in as anything other than disorder. There is no diagnostic code for nigredo, aftermath. There is no clinical category for interregnum of the self. Modern medicine, in its current configuration, can describe the symptom and miss the meaning entirely. I am not telling you to avoid medical care if you need it. I am telling you to know what you are inside. Regardless of what name a clinician offers you for it, Jung was emphatic on this point throughout his career. He observed, in case after case, that patients who were treated only at the symptomatic level, given medication, given behavioral interventions, given the standard tools, often improved in their functioning but failed to complete the phase. They returned to capacity. They did not return to themselves. The phase, when interrupted, simply postponed itself. It would surface again years later, often in a different form, often more severely, because the structural work it was attempting had not been allowed to complete. You have stopped carrying everyone. That act by itself has placed you in the phase. The phase will do its work whether you understand it or not. What understanding offers is not relief, but orientation. You will still feel the emptiness. You will still walk through your interior rooms and find them unfurnished, but you will know where you are. You will not mistake the phase for failure. You will not reach back into the old structure in order to feel briefly recognizable to yourself. You will, instead, learn to stay in the small back room with the window open, with the autumn light, and wait for what is forming to form. There is one more thing I need to say before this part closes. The waiting is not passive. This is the misunderstanding most people bring to the phase. They hear, wait, and think, do nothing. That is not what the phase asks. The phase asks for a very specific kind of attention. It asks you to remain present to your interior without demanding that it produce anything. It asks you to notice the silence without filling it. It asks you to inhabit the empty rooms without redecorating them out of anxiety. This is harder than it sounds. The ego is built to act. The ego, faced with structural absence, will generate any kind of activity in order to feel functional projects, relationships, geographic moves, new identities, and most of that activity will be premature. It will be the false gold the alchemists warned about, a self assembled out of impatience, polished on the outside, hollow at the core. The patience this phase requires is not the patience of waiting for something pleasant to arrive. It is the patience of letting a structure form that you cannot supervise. You will not see it forming. You will not feel it forming. You will feel, mostly, the absence of the old structure, and you will be tempted repeatedly to mistake that absence for evidence that nothing is happening. Something is happening. It is happening below the floor of your awareness, in the part of the psyche that does not report to you on its progress. Your work is to not interfere with it. The people who have completed this phase, and there are some, though they rarely write books about it, because the phase teaches a certain reluctance to perform one's interior, describe it afterward in similar terms. They say that the new self, when it came, did not announce itself. It simply began to be present in small decisions, the way they answered a question, the way they did not answer one, the way they walked into a room and did not adjust themselves to its emotional weather. They did not feel newly whole. They felt, instead, that something which had been forming in the dark had become quiet enough and grounded enough to begin to operate without their needing to verify it. That is what is forming in you now. That is what the empty rooms are making space for. That is what the silence, which still feels like loss, will eventually be revealed to have been holding. The carrying has ended. What you are inside now is the room in which the next self is being assembled by hands that are not yours. I want to take you now into a region of this phase that is rarely spoken about because it is uncomfortable to name and almost impossible to name in the language of healing. The popular framework wants to treat what you are inside as a kind of cocoon, a private, gentle, generative interior in which transformation occurs and from which a more authentic self will eventually emerge. That image is sentimental. It is also incorrect. The interior you are inside is not a cocoon. It is closer to what Jung, following the alchemists, called the vase, the vessel, and the vessel in alchemical work is a sealed container in which substances combine under pressure and heat. The vessel does not protect what is inside it. The vessel contains what is inside it so that the work can proceed without dispersing. You are inside the vessel. The sealing is what creates the loneliness. The pressure is what creates the disorientation. The combining is what creates the strangeness in your own reflection. None of this is gentle. The popular framework gets the gentleness wrong because it confuses the outcome with the process.